Good afternoon, class. This is Jacob Darbone, and I am presenting on HTTP, HTTPS, and AppArmor. This is for ISA 4220, the 2018 spring semester. To get started on this presentation, I will discuss a brief overview of what this presentation will include and go over. Starting off, we will discuss HTTP briefly and the best practices for hardening it, and then we will discuss HTTPS. Then following that, we will discuss AppArmor briefly and give the best practices for hardening that as well. To begin, we will be discussing HTTP, or Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It is a complex application layer protocol used between at least two computers to transfer packets over a network used in conjunction with TCP/IP protocols. The way this connection works is a request-response protocol. So you on the client computer will request a connection to the server, and in response that server will send you the hypertext or the hyperlinks and everything else needed to access that website and view the data listed on that website. HTTP is used to improve communication between clients and servers. It is an unsecure network connection between client and server, and with that connection you access it through port 80. And this is the port the server will pay attention to when requesting packets or hyperlinks from web clients. Next, we'll talk about hardening HTTP. You will want to ensure that you are using port 80 instead of another port that could be used for HTTP. HTTP's default port is port 80, so it is best to follow that recommendation and use port 80 as listed. You also want to reduce information given in a response header to limit as much about your server information as possible. In that request header or response header, your details about your organization and your computer can be seen, and you will want to limit that information as much as possible to limit who and what can see that information and how much information about you and your organization is getting out. You will also want to update regularly. These updates include updating your operating system, your firewalls, and things of that nature. You want to ensure that your systems are up to date as often as possible, so that way when hotfixes for security patches and things of that nature are coming out, that you are getting them and keeping your system as safe and secure as possible. You will also want to control user and admin access. This way you limit who has access to what programs and what tools they can use on the computers and servers. You don't want a user who is inexperienced or has no need to access that type of information or tools to be able to access them, because you then run the risk of that person messing up your policies or regulations you have in place, or deleting or updating configurations in a way that isn't meant to happen regularly on a regular basis. So controlling user admin access is incredibly important. And you also want to control who has access to the network. HTTP is an unsecure network connection, so it allows for middleman attacks and packet sniffing to occur. So you want to make sure that your security for your network is as strong as possible. So make sure potentially the Wi-Fi and the local access network at your organization is secure as possible, so outside entities can't get access to that network and breach your systems and your servers. So controlling who has access to the network is also a very important part. HTTPS is HTTP security. It's just a more secure network. A more secure version of HTTP. And it uses port 443 instead of port 80. It creates a secure connection between server and client rather than an unsecure network like HTTP does. And HTTPS works in conjunction with secure socket layers and transport layer security using an asymmetric public key infrastructure. So this is just a way to ensure that your connection and data transfer from server to client is incredibly secure. And when you use HTTPS instead of HTTP, it must first send the key to the client to make sure that they can decrypt the information properly. And that public key is used to encrypt while the private key is used to decrypt. And it is a far more secure method than HTTP, which most websites and most internet-based entities have switched over to HTTPS. So it increases the security if you're using a bank website or banking account, something of that nature online. It makes that connection secure so people can't come in and install keyloggers and things of that nature to gain access to your bank account information or whatever secure information you're inputting on a website. HTTPS will make sure that that is a secure network connection and that nobody will have access that isn't supposed to. And for hardening HTTPS, it's very similar to hardening HTTP. You will want to keep software up to date as often as possible. You want to use robust SSL certificates to make it harder to retrieve information from your organization and the details from your organization. When that certificate is sent, information about your organization is seen on it. So you want to use robust and secure certificates to ensure that as little information is on it as possible to keep your company and your organization as secure as possible. And similar to HTTP and most other systems, you will want to manage user admin accounts to ensure policies are followed and unaltered. Again, this goes back to making sure that the users and the admins that are on the account have access to only what they need access to, and this will limit the access to those systems and to ensure that your policies and your regulations aren't being altered or switched to less secure policies, or you're not creating conflicting policies and regulations that will mess up your firewall or throw your OS into a more unsecure version, things of that nature. So ensuring those who have access to the system only have access that they need to ensure that your system is as safe as possible. With AppArmor, it is a mandatory access control system, and it's a kernel enhancement that takes programs and limits the access to resources. So this way, they can't do a buffer attack or some type of overload that will cause a service or application to siphon as many resources as possible, potentially crashing your system. So ensuring that the applications and services are limited in their access to resources is a very important aspect of AppArmor. It also binds access controls to the application rather than the users, so it allows you to focus less on user accounts and root accounts and focus more on the controls of the application than the user, which can make it a little more simple for you if you're not used to stuff like that. And it runs 2 modes. These modes include enforcement and complaint. Enforcement obviously enforces the policies put in place and also reports violations, while complaint simply reports on violations without enforcement. So what this means is if you have a new employee that is starting or somebody of that nature, or maybe even a disgruntled employee that's getting ready to be fired or getting ready to be put out the door, you can run enforcement mode for it. So that way it enforces these policies and ensures that they can't go and make policy changes or change accesses or change information about the accounts or information or the applications they're using. And with complaint mode, this could be used for long-term employees or employees that are more trusted. And what this does is doesn't enforce the policies in place, but if they make an attempt on violating or changing anything, the system will report that violation, and that is for a more trusted user potentially, or something of that nature. Lastly, we will be talking about hardening AppArmor. Make sure you enable AppArmor and set up the rules, policies that work most effectively for your network/server needs. What this means is you want to make sure that when you're going into AppArmor and making these new policies or rules, you want to ensure that these policies and rules allow access to the application or service to the extent that is necessary, and make sure that you are limiting any access or potential use of that service or application that lies outside of your company's need for it. So if you were using an application that would allow you to manage a database or something of that nature, it would allow you to have that necessary protection to ensure that somebody just doesn't come in and mess with that database or change it, because you can install a policy or regulation that would cancel a person's attempt at changing that database who didn't have access to it or that wasn't supposed to be making those changes. So with that, it is a more secure way of having applications and services run securely and safely to ensure those who have intent that isn't of good intent, or that somebody who is less knowledgeable in that system can't go in and delete or edit that application or software or service. You also want to make sure you start the system properly. For AppArmor, you have to run it as a service, and you have to make sure that you start it on boot up, so that way it can do its job. If you fail to do that, then your AppArmor becomes useless and it won't enforce the policies and regulations you have put in place, altering it or making it useless as a service for having. So you want to make sure you start that system properly. And you also want to make sure the service application you want to put policies on is running, to make sure AppArmor changes take effect and work properly for each service and application. The reason for this is, since AppArmor has to be running, you also want to make sure that the services and applications are running. So that way when you make these changes actively, that the system will recognize it and enforce those policies and regulations. So in order for that to occur, you want to make sure that the application or service that you want to put this service on is running. And if it's not, then the changes won't take effect and your system will not be secure. So for that, you want to make sure that the system, service, or application is running. And that concludes this presentation that talks about HTTP, HTTPS, and AppArmor, as well as hardening those systems and services. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and I look forward to your presentations next week. Thank you.